Here this morning. This morning we're on lesson 10 about parables on being ready for the Lord's return. We'll be in Matthew chapter 24 and 25 this morning for the pretty much all of our study this morning. So if you'll turn to Matthew chapter 24, that's where we will be. Before we get into our lesson this morning, I've asked Brother Darren if he would lead us in a prayer. Darren, would you do that, please?
Let's go to God in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we're so grateful that you're our God, so grateful for all the blessings that you provide. We're thankful for being able to gather this morning so we can study your word. We're so grateful for the teachers that are willing to take the time and prepare for our classes and to help us through our studies. We're so thankful, God, that you provided us the parables. You've given us something to dig into and to study, not just to glance through, Father, that each one has a special meaning and that we should try to understand that meaning and how to apply it to our lives so we can better serve you. Father, we regret that some of our brothers and sisters can't be here today because they're sick and ill or have other issues. Father, we ask you to help them to get through those things and bring them back to us so we can be together and be able to encourage one another and to help each other as we all serve you. Father, we love you so much, and we thank you for the love you've shown us through your Son. Thank you for him dying on the cross for our sins. And Father, let us always remember that and to always strive to live our lives more perfectly aligned with your word. We ask you to be with us this morning as we continue to study the parables. For all these things, in Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, Darren. All right, so we're going to start this morning with the background like we have been doing, but we're talking about the parable of the delaying servants, which is in Matthew 24, verse 45. But no surprise, we're going to talk about the background for a little bit. I think we need to set up the background and the context of this chapter. If you remember our discussion last week, we talked about the parable of the tenants. And we spoke about how in that context, Jesus was speaking to the Jews and the religious leaders about having the kingdom potentially taken away from them as a result of their rejection of him, their rejection of the plan that God had to bring about the kingdom, and the problems that would arise with that. In that context, we actually looked forward to Matthew chapter 24. We talked about it very briefly last week with the parable of the fig tree. So if you'll remember, as we talked about Matthew chapter 24, Jesus is speaking at the beginning of this chapter about the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. And as the chapter progressed, we saw the parable of the fig tree, which Jesus was telling that there were signs, there were indicators that this event would come, right? We talked last week about how the Jews should not have been surprised by the coming change in the nature of the kingdom and the things that Jesus was doing. They should not have been surprised, but they were, right? Which led to their rejection in that parable last week. In Matthew chapter 24, all of this discussion comes about because at the beginning of the chapter, Jesus tells his disciples that the temple is going to be destroyed. He says there will not be one stone left unturned. That temple would be destroyed. This idea that things are changing, that same idea we talked about last week. Things are going to be changing for the Jews, and they should be looking for that. And so the disciples ask Jesus the question, well, when? Right? When is this going to happen? There's actually multiple questions here. When is this going to happen? What will be the signs of your second coming? What will be the signs of the end of the age? And so Jesus is answering these multiple questions in chapter 24 and chapter 25. So that's the context of our discussion today. And we mentioned it last week, but we'll look at it in a little bit more detail now, that Jesus starts with the destruction of Jerusalem, but he transitions over the course of this chapter to the final judgment, as that's the question that everyone seems to be asking him. The point that this transition takes place in the chapter, where it moves from the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple to the final judgment, sometimes can be a little bit unclear. But I believe it happens in verse 36, right? In verse 36 of Matthew 24, where Jesus says, "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone." This and the next couple verses, which we're actually going to read in just a minute, seem to be speaking more about final judgment, more so than the destruction of Jerusalem. And like I said, I think the language in the next couple verses will help us see that, and we'll get to that in a second. So in this discussion, again, Jesus is transitioning from this conversation about the nation of the Jews and the destruction of the temple to final judgment. So as we move towards our parable, I believe that's the context that we will find ourselves in, is final judgment and what that looks like and what they needed to know about it. So let's actually read starting there. In verse 36, we're going to read from there up to the parable to kind of help us get a little bit more of this background. Matthew chapter 24, starting in verse 36. "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered in the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. Then there will be two men in the field, and one will be taken away, and one will be left. Two women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken, and one will be left. Therefore, be on alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert, and would not have allowed his house to be broken into. For this reason, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think that he will." Right? So here, Jesus has shifted our focus. Again, if you remember the beginning half of this chapter, talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, this end to the Jewish nation as God's exclusive chosen people, think about the way Jesus described that event, which we talked about last week, right? There will be signs. There will be indicators. You will see this coming. He made the point in the parable of the fig tree, right? That you can see the change coming by the way that the branches change. You can see this coming. Right after that parable, he says that this generation will not pass away until these things take place, indicating that this is coming soon, right? This event, this first event. But now, again, that it's a very clear, definitive description of the coming signs of that destruction. But now, verse 36 on, which we just read, notice the difference in how Jesus is speaking about this event he's talking about here. No one knows when it will come. It will come as a surprise, right? There's many illustrations here to help strengthen this point about this coming being a surprise. He talks about Noah, right? And how all the other people who were destroyed by the flood did not know it was coming, right? There were no warnings to those people. They did not know this was going to take place until when? They started to drown, right? That's the point that they noticed, when it was too late. Jesus next, in the moment of the coming of the Son of Man, he talks about two men working. One will be taken away, one will be left. I think simply indicating that one will be protected from this destruction that's coming, and one will not, this judgment, right? Indicating salvation. One will be saved, one will not. Indicating this idea that judgment is taking place. Judgment is coming with this moment as well. Be on the alert, is what Jesus says. You do not know when this is coming, right? But when it does, there will be no more delay, right? No extra returns, right? A lot of people in today's world, we have denominations teaching these ideas of Jesus coming, and then these years of maybe tribulation, right? Time where you have a chance to get ready and be prepared for what's coming. And Jesus is saying, no. There are going to be no signs of this coming, right? You will have no warning, no indicators. You must be on alert because you do not know when this is coming. And this is a difficult chapter, and Jesus even warns of this earlier in the chapter. When Jesus began answering these questions in verse 4, he told them, "See to it that no one misleads you," right? Setting their mind at the very beginning of this discussion, people are going to get this wrong, right? This is going to be confused by many people. Make sure you note what I'm saying now. In verse 6, he says, "You'll hear rumors of war. See that you're not frightened." Right? Note what he's saying. He is saying people are going to get this wrong. And if we think about our religious world today, people are getting it wrong, right? We hear all kinds of explanations about the end of the world and the 7 years of tribulation and all of these different ideas taught about warnings and indications. We have people today trying to calculate from the Bible when these things will occur, right? These complicated calculations, and Jesus is making it very simple. No one knows when this is coming. That's it. Nobody knows. Jesus even says he doesn't know. Right? He said the Father alone knows. That was in verse 36. Nobody knows when this is coming. So you can see, again, the change that is happening in this chapter. Right? No longer are we talking about an event that we can see coming, that we can be, that we can know is about to happen. Right? It's an event that will take us by surprise and catch us off guard in his second coming and the final judgment to come with it. So again, Jesus has shifted our mindset, and he gives this phrase, and he'll give this phrase multiple times about being alert, being on guard, right, and being prepared. And that's kind of how Jesus has framed our mindset as he goes into our first parable for this morning. So let's go ahead and read our parable. The first parable is the parable of the delaying servants. This is in verse 45. "Who then is the faithful and sensible slave whom his master put in charge of his household to give them food at the proper time? Blessed is the slave whom his master finds doing so when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But if that evil slave says in his heart, 'My master is not coming for a long time,' and begins to beat his fellow slaves and eat and drink with drunkards, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and in an hour which he does not know, and he will cut him into pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites, in that place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Question number 2, in regards to this parable, who is the master? If you were looking, I just threw it up on the board accidentally. Who is the master, JD?
God, given the context a little bit previously talked about, and plus sending him to where there shall be weeping, gnashing of teeth. That's always an indicator of, well, hell, and there's only one being in the universe that can actually guarantee send someone to that. So that kind of is a bit of a giveaway in that regard.
Yeah, I think there's aspects both of God and Jesus given here, right? Like JD said, we have this idea of him returning and this judgment taking place would tell us God. But Jesus has also been talking about his return. I think would indicate Jesus as well. I think both would apply. I don't think either one would necessarily change the discussion. But I think there's aspects of both. But yeah, it's this idea of this coming, right, that we've been talking about, this coming judgment at the end of days. Is this master and his return. Who are the servants? People, right? Exactly, people of the church. Yeah, we're talking about the servants of the master. If the master is God or Jesus, it would be servants of God, the people of God. Jesus has been speaking about the Jews, so I think this would apply to them and those people that were listening at that time. But also, we are servants of God, right? We are in the kingdom today, and so this would naturally apply to us as well. There is direct application for us to take away from this. What was this servant tasked with? JD?
Well, what I can gather, it's basically the servant was tasked with doing the job set before him, yet also keeping an eye out, always being ready for when the master will show up. Even if he didn't know when the master would show up, he knew his master was on his way, so he just knew he had to be ready for whenever his master would decide to show up, be it the next day, the next minute. He just had to be ready and doing his job as master assigned to him.
Yeah, he had to be ready because he was tasked with a very broad command, right? To take care of the household. There's a lot that would come with that. To provide for the house as needed. This likely meant this servant was expected to take care of cleaning, cooking, tending to the animals, mowing the lawn, taking out the trash, right? All of these different things that are around taking care of the household would fall to the responsibility of this servant. There were things expected of him, generally to look after all belongings and all possessions of the master. This servant has been tasked with a lot, right? And we see two scenarios for how this servant might handle this situation. Right? The first servant, the master comes home and finds him working, finds him doing as he's told. Things are clean, things are in order, everyone is well fed, everything looks as if it is supposed to. But then the second servant, right? Very opposite of that. What is he doing while the master is gone?
He's just really pleasing himself with whatever he wants to do in an evil way.
Yeah, he's doing just about everything except for what he's supposed to do, right? He's wasting time on other things. He's neglecting the household. We're even told he's beating members of the household, right? He is not taking care of the household. There's a very stark difference between these two servants, right? One is doing exactly what is asked. The other is not. Was there a comment over here, Kyle?
Well, I was just noting that the focus, it seems, that the master gave to the servant was to tend to the fellow servants, to give them their food in due season. It says in verse 45, and then you just pointed out in verse 49, the evil servant beating his fellow servants. It reminds me of what Jesus said were the greatest commandments: to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, to love your neighbor as yourself. You know, we have a responsibility towards each other, and whether if we're focused on ourselves or eating and drinking with drunkards, and we're pleasing our own flesh rather than serving other people, that's going to be a basis of judgment against us.
Exactly, and you said it a couple of times in your answer there, in your comment, that it's a responsibility, right, to love others and to do these things that are commanded, and this servant very clearly was neglecting his responsibility. When the master came back, there was no question this servant was not doing what he was asked to do, and quite to the other extreme, right? He was abusing his situation and the things that were expected of him. Question 4, what is the coming of the master representing, right? If we follow the earthly aspect of this parable for just a second, what is the master coming back to do? What will he do upon his return?
He's going to judge the performance of his servant.
Exactly. He's coming back. One, he lives here, but he's coming back to judge the situation. That will be what he does. He will judge whether or not the servant has done what he asked. He is showing up to test, right? This is that moment where things get real. And now there is no more time for preparation on behalf of the servant. He's either done what he's supposed to do or not. And the master is going to know, right? You think about this foolish servant, this is that moment of panic, right? When he realizes, I have not been doing what I'm supposed to do. How quickly can I get things in order so that maybe the master doesn't notice? But in reality, he will realize that it is too late. He is caught. So what does this represent?
Well, the big word I think about is faithful. That's what he's emphasizing in verse 45, who's going to be faithful, and this is speaking about the second coming of Christ, final judgment on where we'll spend eternity.
Yeah, exactly. We've been talking about that, right? That return of Christ and the coming judgment, that final judgment. And Ben used the word faithfulness, right? Whether or not these servants have been faithful. It's talking about Jesus coming back and judging whether or not the servants of God have been faithful, right? That's the conversation we've been having, or that Jesus has been having. That's the discussion taking place. It's like I said a minute ago, it's that moment when things get real, right? And in that moment, there is no more time for preparation. God is going to judge whether or not his servants have done what they were asked to do or not. In regards to the final judgment, there will be no running around trying to make sure things are in place, hoping that God doesn't notice that they're not, right? In that moment, it's over. The master will be able to tell immediately whether or not we have been responsible and faithful and doing as we're supposed to. Stephen?
Yeah, you're talking about the transition earlier, in verse 35, right before, he really specifies this, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. If you think about this context, the master's words are not going to go away. And what he required of you is still required. There's no way to get out.
Exactly, yeah. As soon as the master came back, there was no excuse, right? The servant couldn't say, well, you've been gone a long time, so I figured I was off the hook, right? No, these things were lasting. This command did not go away, and he was held accountable when the master came back. Question 5, why did the servant delay, right? If he knew the master was coming back, he knew what was expected, why would he choose to delay it? The parable tells us.
The master's not coming for a long time.
Yeah, my master is not coming for a long time. He assumed that he had time, right? I'll get to it later. There's other things I'd rather be doing. There's other things that I'm going to choose to do right now. I'll have plenty of opportunity later to take care of these things that I'm responsible for. And then, as we know, either the master comes back earlier than expected, or he lost track of time. He is totally caught off guard and unprepared when the master returns.
Yeah, I think that's really the thing. We tend to look at these guys and say, well, they had really no intent to be good people. That's the evil people in the world, not the servants. But I don't know if that's the case. I think the indication is that he may not have intended to be evil. It's just time. He just thought he had time. Okay, I'll take care of that later. Yeah, I haven't been as faithful as I can right now, but I'm young. As I get older, there'll be time. And time is just these two chapters, or this chapter particularly, is teaching us these parables that time is not guaranteed. We see it all around us. We just never want to apply it to ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They didn't set off with an immediate motive to be evil, right? To immediately deny this command. They felt they had more time. They felt that they could get to it later.
Lack of respect for the master, too. If regardless of what your political leanings are, if the President of the United States was coming to your house, you would make preparation. You wouldn't even circle it on your calendar because you would remember. It'd be there. You'd know. And if you're not respecting the master, you're not going to be ready.
Yeah, lack of respect. You know what this makes me think of? For those of you who don't know, that was my dad that answered that question a minute ago. My parents are here. This makes me think of a lot of those moments when I was younger. I was a messy kid, right? My room was always a wreck. Those moments where mom would tell me, I'm going to the store to get something. I want your room clean by the time I get back. You see where I'm going with that?
Did you delay?
We'll get there. There's really two ways that scenario can play out, right? Either I start cleaning as soon as mom walks out the door so that when she gets back, my room is in perfect condition, right? It is up to her standards. Or you're the other kid, maybe me, who thinks, well, it's going to take mom 20 minutes to get to the grocery store. She'll take a few minutes there, 20 minutes back, I'm golden, right? I've got time, right? I can get to this later, so let's watch some TV right now. Let's do something else, right? I'm going to clean my room. I'm going to get to it, but a little bit later, right? I've got plenty of time before Mom gets back. Then about 45 minutes later, you hear the garage door open. Oh, no. I'm throwing things in any drawer that has open space. I'm leaning up against my closet door trying to make sure she doesn't see this stuff, right? There's probably more clothes thrown under the bed than are left in the closet. Do you think my mom noticed? Mom, did you notice? Yeah, my mom noticed. I was caught in that moment, and it was very apparent that I had wasted time, right? I had not done what was expected. I thought I had plenty of time, right? But time got away from me, right? I'll get to that later. I thought I could get to it later, but now I'm grounded, right? Now, thankfully, my mom was much nicer and did not cut me into pieces like the servants, but there definitely may have been some weeping and gnashing of teeth. But I should not have delayed, right? That's a relatable situation. We've probably all been in something similar, either on the instructing end as a parent or as the kid who received that instruction and instead chose to scramble trying to solve the chores that I had chosen to delay. It's easy to see, like was mentioned a minute ago, how you fall prey to this mindset, right? It's not an immediate rejection at the get-go that I'm not going to do this. It's, well, I've got time, right? I can get to it later. And that's often how we think. And that's what Jesus is warning us against. That mindset of delaying and believing that we have time and feeling confident in our assumptions on how much time that we have. And it's dangerous because Jesus, like he said, this is coming at a moment where you will not expect it, right? You will be surprised. You will be caught off guard. And you will be judged by the state of your preparedness in that moment. No last-minute preparation. No throwing the clothes under the bed at the last second, right? You will be judged on the way things look at that moment. Delaying is dangerous. Waiting until later is risky because we don't know when he's coming back. We don't know when that moment will come where our faithfulness will be measured. So we need to be careful. And that's our takeaway from this parable, right? Be responsible with the time you have now because any second could be your last, right? Jesus could come back right now. And if we are not ready, there will be no more second chances. Remember, Jesus is answering the question of the disciples. What will be the signs and the indications of this coming end, right? Of your coming back. They were wanting to know, how do we know when this is coming so we can make sure we're ready? And Jesus says, you won't expect it. So be ready now and stay ready. We need to be responsible servants of God. This is not just a message for the Jews and for these disciples. It is a message for us. God has tasked us with work to do in the kingdom. We've talked about it a couple of weeks in the past, right, about the parables that Jesus tells about responsibility of the things that we have to do in the kingdom. Right? We have responsibilities. We have expectations from God and commands from God that we are to fulfill and participate in. And if we don't, we will not be ready when he comes back. Stephen?
You know, in this scenario, he heard from the master, as far as we know, only one time. He was given that command. And this occurred, this reasoning, this rationalization occurred in the servant's heart. Something that we can do that wasn't available. Jesus gave this. You're doing it for us today. You're reminding us. And so we can be reminded. I can listen to my master every single day. If the master would have come back and said, hey, servant, you need to be doing this, I think there'd be much less time for him to rationalize within himself. Because that time has been discussed. You know, if you go down the wrong path of your thinking, you just start going away and away. But if we're reminding ourselves, hearing from the master every day, it's going to be much harder for us to take that mindset.
Yep, constant reminder helps.
God's a loving God, and he'll always be there for us. But and a lot of people talk about his love, but in 51 it talks. You know, it's very violent, it's very intense, and it's not just that you go to timeout, or not just that. Even he could have said, you know, your portion will be with the hypocrites. You'll be cast with the hypocrites. Or he said, you know, you'll be cast with the hypocrites where there's weeping, gnashing teeth. it's like each level is like another ratcheted up moment. It's like, I will cut you into pieces. Like that's serious, right?
Yeah, it's very serious, right? No warnings, no second chances. And like you said, a lot of people today don't want to think about it that way, right? God's a loving God, right? He would not condemn anyone to hell. He wouldn't condemn anyone to that weeping and gnashing of teeth. But Jesus is making it clear, and he has made it clear through many parables. You know what's expected, right? The standard has been set. This servant knew what the master required of him. It wasn't as if there was any question. He knew, and he chose not to do it. So you should not be surprised by what you reap, right, and what comes to you. We're going to continue on. We're not done with this discussion. We're going to keep reading in the book of Matthew here, because there's another parable, right? Very similar mindset, very similar thoughts. So let's look at that now. Let's keep reading and continue this discussion. In Matthew, now we're in 25, starting in verse 1. The parable of the 10 virgins. Then the kingdom of heaven will be compared to 10 virgins, who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 were prudent. But when the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them. But the prudent took oil in flasks, along with their lamps. Now, while the bridegroom was delaying, they all got drowsy and began to sleep. But at midnight there was a shout, "Behold, the bridegroom, come out to meet him." Then all those virgins rose and trimmed their lamps. The foolish said to the prudent, "Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." And the prudent answered, "No, there will not be enough for us and you too. Go instead to the dealers and buy some for yourselves." And while they were going away to make the purchase, the bridegroom came, and then those who were ready went with him to the wedding feast, and the door was shut. Later the other virgins also came, saying, "Lord, Lord, open up for us." But he answered, "Truly I say to you, I do not know you. Be on the alert then, for you do not know the day nor the hour." I'm going to ask our questions out of order from the book, so don't be surprised for that. But I'll start with question 4. What do the lamps of oil represent in this parable? What are the lamps of oil in this parable? Angela? Our souls, okay. I think there's a connection to that for sure. Stephen?
I thought this was the hardest question. But this one was, I think it's more like the avenue of how you present your life before God. So I was trying to think about how does the oil represent in that, what's powering the lamp. It's kind of your life, how your life should shine before the Lord, possibly.
Yeah. Well, no, I think you're definitely both on the same track of mind where I was. But let me set up this scene and see if this helps. You're not. Neither of you are wrong. Let me say that first off. Let me set up this scene. It was customary at this time for weddings often to be done outdoors, right? Larger spaces where more people can come. They would often do it by some water source, like a stream or a river or something that might be near. And these are usually performed in the evening, right? When it's dark. And then right after this, it would be done in the evening because right after this they would go to a dinner celebration that was customary, that would often last maybe even a couple of days. So it's going to be dark at this ceremony. So these virgins had the responsibility of lighting the ceremony, right? That's what these lamps were, light, right? To be able to see. So if you picture what's happening here, this ceremony will only be seen by those who attend it if these virgins do their job, right? That's their responsibility. So they will go out to the appointed place at the appointed time where the ceremony was to happen, and as soon as they saw the bride and groom coming towards them, they would get their lamps and their torches lit, right? Light the environment, ready for this ceremony to take place. But remember the times that we're in. There's no wristwatches. There's no cell phones. They didn't know what time it was. Nobody could text them and say, "Hey, we're on our way. Get ready," right? The only way they knew that this ceremony was to start was by visual confirmation that the bride and groom were coming, right? Until that moment happens, they don't know when it's coming. Maybe they've planned ahead and maybe there is a set appointed time, but that clearly things didn't go to plan in this parable. These lamps, these torches of oil, are the responsibility of these virgins. And I think that's what we're getting at here, is the responsibility of the individual, right? And I definitely think to our two answers, right, it's getting to our souls and our lives and how we handle it, how we handle our responsibilities, whether or not our lives live up to that responsibility. So it's the work that has been tasked to these virgins, and I think in the same way, it would be the work that is tasked to us, right? Very similar to the work that was tasked to the servant in the parable before this, right? We're talking about expectations of the individual and how that plays out with their responsibilities. And so we'll go ahead and connect that to these virgins, right? We've got these wise and these foolish virgins. Similar to the last parable, there's two different scenarios regarding how these responsibilities are handled with the wise and then the foolish. These wise virgins were prepared, right? They brought the lamps that they were expected to bring, and just in case, they brought some extra oil. Why do you think they thought to bring extra?
Something can happen.
Anything could happen, right? They wanted to make sure that they were prepared. They didn't know how much they would need. They didn't know how much extra they would need. They didn't know when the bridegroom was going to come, so they thought, my role is very important, so I'm going to make sure I am ready to do it. That was their mindset. That's why they were wise. That's why they brought extra oil. But the foolish virgins, obviously, did not. Right? They did not bring this oil. It's very likely that they just left whatever oil was already in the lamp or already on the torch, and they went, right? Why would they not bring extra?
They're not prepared.
They're not prepared, right? They thought they were fine, right? They assumed they had enough. The ceremony's probably 20 minutes. I've got enough for 20 to 25 minutes. I'm good, right? I've got enough to last it. But obviously what happens? Like we said, things didn't go according to plan. The ceremony was delayed. They didn't know they would need more. Jesus also makes a point here to make it known. It was delayed by a long time, right? This was a big delay. So much so they had time to lay down and take a nap, right? This clearly was not what they were expecting to happen. And they ran out of oil. They did not prepare for that delay. So, panic, right? We need oil. They start asking the people around them, hey, you brought oil, can I have some of that for myself? No, right? The ones who were prepared probably would have run out of oil too, had they not brought extra. So they're using their extra. There's nothing left for those foolish virgins. They did not bring what they needed. There's multiple things here that really make me think about how foolish these virgins were. We've already kind of talked about it a little bit, but right, the moment where they start panicking is when the bride and groom start walking in, right? You should have panicked long before that moment, right? You waited way too long to realize that there was a problem. It was very clear that they would not make it back in time in that moment, right? That's not the moment to walk out of the building and go find something extra, right? You waited too long. And not only did they wait too long and not prepare, when they realized things are delayed, they took a nap, right? If they were going to lay down and take a nap, clearly they knew, okay, we've got a little bit of time. That should have also been an indicator. We're going to run out of oil. We are not going to be prepared for this situation. You have a comment?
Along the lines of speculation, as we are doing, they didn't use the resources wisely. They should have put the lamps off. Probably that would have saved some of the oil. So it's how we use our resources as well.
Very possible, right? That they could have turned them off, right? And saved that oil, but they did not handle those things responsibly. Tanya?
I mean, kind of along that vein too, when they saw that there was going to be a delay, they could have gone and tried to get back in time. So I feel like that applies to us as well. When we find ourselves getting off track as Christians, and God wakes us up the next day, on indication He's giving you an opportunity to fix it and turn around and not sit in it and make excuses why you can't get out of it. So we have to be careful, because it's not just, I don't think it's not just about resources, or even necessarily just about sharing the gospel. If you can't manage yourself, you can't pick yourself up when you have fallen down, and he's giving you countless opportunities to change it, then you're not using that time wisely either. Because every day above ground is an opportunity to do something different. It's after that we find ourselves in that situation where it's too late, or he comes back and we're in a situation that we don't want to be in. So we might want to look at it from that perspective as well.
I think you're exactly right. They had plenty of opportunities to notice the predicament that they were in, and maybe come up with solutions to that problem. Again, not that they knew when the bridegroom was coming, but even though they didn't know, there were still ways they could notice that they were not prepared. So what do these things represent, right, as we talk about the meaning of this parable? I think it's fairly obvious. I'm going to go ahead and throw it up there. Right, we're talking about those who are prepared and those who are unprepared, right? That's exactly how we describe the actions of these wise and foolish virgins. Very similarly to the last parable, right? We were talking about preparedness, being prepared for the moment, that moment that will come when no more preparation is allowed. Are you prepared or are you unprepared? That's the question Jesus is talking about, which is why Jesus continuously emphasizes this point of be on the alert in verse 13. For you do not know the hour or the day. He is continually reminding them, you don't know when this is coming, so be ready. Right? The parables that we've looked at, they've made that similar point. They share that point in common, that you don't know when the master is going to come back. You don't know when the bridegroom is coming. You don't know when that ceremony will take place. We don't know when Jesus is coming and when judgment will take place, but we need to be ready and prepared either way. Very similar points. However, I think there's also a different point made between the two parables, a different focus. Can you recognize the difference between the point in these two parables? And what is it?
Say that again?
Do you recognize a difference between the point of, really, if you look at the foolish in one versus the foolish in the next, is there a difference maybe in potential application? Matthew?
In the first one, the master returns before the servant expected him. He wanted is going to get ready later. In the second, the bridegroom delays longer. So these foolish virgins apparently would have been ready if he got there on time, but eventually they don't maintain that state of readiness over time.
Exactly. I think that's exactly right. In the last parable, the foolish servant wrongfully assumed, I've got plenty of time to get this done, I'll do it later, right? And then in this one, the foolish virgins wrongfully assume, I'm prepared because there's not much time left, right? I've done enough so I can sit back and wait, right? The similarity, both assumed they knew when the return would happen, but both were wrong to very different extremes, right? The servant wasted his time and chose to do something else and did not get ready. The virgins with the bridegroom prepared what they thought was enough, and then they stopped. They stopped taking care of their responsibility. They stopped paying attention to it because they felt things were sufficient at that moment, right?
I'm thinking back to when Jesus talked about a man that's plowing the field. If he looks back, he's unworthy of the kingdom of heaven. Not many of us plow fields, but we all drive. You've got to keep your eye on the road. If you're looking off the side, you're going to veer off the road. And that's kind of what he's saying here. You got to keep your eye on what.
Yeah, keep your eye on the goal. That's similar to what Stephen said earlier, but that constant reminder. You don't get in the driver's seat of a car, look where you're going, and then take a nap and hope the car gets there, right? You constantly look at the road and constantly course correct to check to make sure you're on the right path. And neither the servant nor the virgins did that, right? At least the foolish ones did not. Stephen?
I think another difference here is also that the evil servant in the first parable, he actually chose to do things to please himself and be evil. I mean, he was going counter. Like, I'm just going to serve myself in this time. I'm not It's not just, hey, and the other one, I think we've done enough, but I'm not gonna just overtly go against my master. I think when they said, I'm just against the master. No, the other one's like, I'm going against the master.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting that, like Stephen said, the servant was very defiant, took care of himself, took part in evil things. The virgins were there. They thought they were ready. But who got the worst condemnation? Neither one, right? Both of them were condemned equally, right? Both were a problem. Both of these things, these mindsets, are dangerous things that Jesus is trying to combat and trying to get people to wake up from. Don't assume you know when the master is coming, because that can lead to lots of different issues, right? Don't assume that you have time to prepare later. Delaying in preparing to face God could result in you being surprised, caught off guard, and unprepared, right? And you will see judgment. If I'm unprepared when Jesus returns, I will face judgment. I will face the destruction that Jesus assures to us. And I shouldn't expect anything different. But also, we cannot assume that we've done enough, right? We can't assume that, I'm a Christian, I've obeyed the gospel, I've taught a few people, I'm good enough, things are good enough where we're at, right? I'll sit back and wait now. I'll let somebody else do the work now. I've done my part, right? Both very dangerous attitudes that Jesus is condemning equally. And Jesus is constantly reminding, you do not know when this is coming. Be prepared.
Think about that song, I'm just gonna let children let their light shine. We always gotta let our light shine.
Yeah, you don't turn the light off, right? You continue it. You don't hide it. Nothing should change it. It should be continual. Matthew?
We need to be careful here. These passages, the condemnation is not equal. The servant is cut to pieces and thrown out where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. The virgins aren't let in. Neither one of them gets in, but that doesn't, there is still some difference. Like, later Jesus talks about, the one who doesn't do the master's will, but doesn't know is beaten with few blows, and the one who knows and doesn't do it is beaten with many blows. And so there is, similarly here, there's a distinction in the punishment.
Maybe. Right, but let's follow that thought for a minute on to our next question, right? What does the shut door represent?
No entrance.
No entrance into what? Jesus says he's talking about the kingdom, right? That those who are not prepared, who find themselves unprepared, will not be allowed into the celebration feast, right? The door will be shut. You will be told by the master, I don't even know you. Right, so it doesn't immediately sound as graphic as being cut into pieces, but whether I'm cut into pieces or not allowed into the kingdom, I'm not going to split hairs as to which one's worse. Those are both bad, and I think ultimately being shut out of the kingdom would result in the ultimate destruction, leading to weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's the idea of being cut off from the kingdom. These virgins were not allowed into this feast or this celebration. Why? Because this feast or this celebration was for those who were in the wedding, who participated, who attended it. They missed it. Because they found themselves unprepared, they had to leave and go try to take care of what they needed. That's why they were not allowed in. This was not for them. They didn't deserve to be here. That's why they were told, depart, for I don't know you. They were completely shut off from this reward. In the same way that we, if we are unprepared, will be shut off from the kingdom. We will not be allowed to enter the kingdom if we don't responsibly play our role and take care of the responsibilities that God has tasked us with. That's what this shut door represents. And note as well, it was question 6, that the door is not reopened. There were no second chances, right? There's no serve your time now and then maybe get let in later, right? Which combats this idea in today's religious world that you may go to hell and serve time for a little while. No, it is permanent. That door is permanently closed to you. and you will not be allowed in. There are no second chances, no warnings, no indications. So when Jesus gets here, we had better find ourselves prepared. And I think that's obviously the point Jesus is making in these two parables. So next week we'll move on to the next lesson, continuing a lot of these same thoughts, but be prepared for that. Thank you.